Alright, so we did a top 5 paddles for control video about 8 months ago, but things have changed a lot since then, so it's time to shuffle things up a little bit, and yes, I'm back in Hawaii for this one. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I do eventually want to make a top 5 power paddles video, but with all the turmoil surrounding foam paddles these days, I think it's time to wait for all that to settle down a bit. I was also thinking a top 5 all court list, which we will be doing soon, don't worry. But when I went back and watched that top 5 control paddles video, I thought, okay, it's probably time for an update. Now before we get into any of the criteria here, I do just want to remind you, as usual, that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comments section what you want me to cover next. So, we're going to talk about the top 5 paddles for control, and I do just quickly want to go over some of the common characteristics you look for in a control paddle. The most important thing is, of course, softness. When a paddle is soft, it soaks up the ball's energy during dwell time, which increases control because it doesn't push it as far into your opponent's court. Soft paddles also have a really long dwell time, which means you have a little bit more time to control exactly where you want to drop the ball. Another important characteristic is sweet spot size. A bigger sweet spot makes a paddle more forgiving, which is key in the control game, especially when you get into a dinking contest and you have no room for error. Whereas a paddle with a small sweet spot could punish you after the slightest mishit, a big sweet spot will help you out more often than not, which gives you greater confidence in your paddle. The one caveat to this is foam paddles. Foam paddles have massive sweet spots, but the whole idea behind a bigger sweet spot is to make the soft game easier. Foam paddles make the soft game harder. They add a spring effect onto the ball, which makes it much more difficult to control their launch, so I won't be including any foam paddles on this list. I know I've said that foam paddles are actually very good in the control game if you know how to use them, but that's just it. Knowing how to use them is what's difficult. Maneuverability is also very important in a control paddle because the control game will almost always bring you up into the kitchen where your reaction time is shorter. Having a paddle that's soft but super clunky may be fine while you're dinking, but as soon as there's a speed up or a chance for you to put away the point, you could be hung out to dry. That brings me nicely to my next point. To make this list, a paddle can't be exclusively good for control, which I know might sound counterintuitive, but let me explain. At this point in pickleball, if you're one-dimensional, whether it's being too reliant on power, spin, or control, you'll get exposed. So even if you lean more toward a control style, you still need some variety. Same with your paddle. You want something that will hold its own for spin, and yes, for power if you do get a chance to put away the point. Hopefully that makes sense. Finally, I'm going to keep saying it, we need to carry these paddles at the store. I think you all get that by now, but without further ado, let's get into number 5. Coming in at number 5, we have 2 paddles because they're from the same line and I really can't figure out which one is actually better for control, but both of these paddles represent that well-rounded criteria better than probably every other paddle on this list. They definitely have the firmest overall feel, which is why I can't put them any higher than 5th, but they're still excellent for control. Coming in at number 5, we have the Honolulu Pickleball J3K and J2K. I'll explain the difference between the two in a second, but apart from the shape, they have the same core and top sheet construction, so a really similar feel on contact. What makes them so great for control is their Kevlar top sheet. Kevlar provides a more plush feel than carbon, especially when you're swinging softly. Kevlar also makes the sweet spot feel a little bigger. The plush feel spreads all around the paddle face so that when you do make contact off center, you still get a fairly nice soft response. Of course, the 6-0 Ruby is also a great controlled Kevlar paddle, but I've always found the Honolulu Pickleball paddles to be a tiny bit softer, and the important thing here is that the J2K and J3K are more forgiving. Yes, even the J2K, which I know looks very similar to the Ruby, it doesn't flare inward as much at the bottom of the paddle face, which makes the sweet spot a little bit wider overall. That does also make it slightly less maneuverable, but that's generally the price you pay for a bigger sweet spot and why I do consider it slightly better in the control game. The J3K is obviously very different to the Ruby and the J2K. It's a wide body standard length paddle, so it has a very big sweet spot, and it's also extremely maneuverable. It has quite a long handle, which means the paddle face is slightly shorter than a lot of other sub 16-inch paddles, so you do sacrifice a little bit of sweet spot size in exchange for that hand speed, but more advanced players are happy to do that. This shape gives you huge deception potential in the soft game, where you can feign hitting a shot in a certain direction, and then at the last second use that quick hand speed to change it up. Now I do quickly want to touch on just how well-rounded these paddles are, because like I said earlier, that's extremely important for paddles nowadays. The J2K I actually said was the most well-rounded paddle of the year in our year-end paddle awards, so as you can imagine, spin and power are also top-notch. It's the same with the J3K, a little less top-end power and spin because of the shorter shape, but still excellent. The only reason these don't come in higher is, again, they are a little bit firmer than average for paddles on this list. Next up, we have a paddle that's kind of the opposite to the J2K and the J3K in that it's very, very control-oriented, but not quite as well-rounded. Coming in at number 4, we have the Bread and Butter Fat Boy. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not the biggest fan of this paddle, but that has more to do with this shape and style not necessarily suiting my game, and very little to do with the actual quality of the paddle. What you get with the Fat Boy is a great soft feel and a massive sweet spot. In that regard, it's one of the very best paddles right now. When you compare it to the J3K, which has a similar length, the shape is actually very different. The Fat Boy has a more traditional wide body design with the paddle face coming down a lot lower. More paddle face surface area expands the sweet spot. Remember, you already had a really big sweet spot on the J3K, so you can just imagine how big it is on the Fat Boy. You won't be mishitting many balls with this paddle, and when you do, I can promise you that it's more likely to be your fault than the paddles. To be fair, it usually is your fault, but here it takes a lot more effort to screw up than with most. Now, the Fat Boy actually has a blended Kevlar and carbon top sheet, but because it has so much paddle face surface area, it feels actually a little bit softer than the full Kevlar J3K and J2K. It's also a little bit muted, which is great because that kills vibrations, which makes the paddle feel even more forgiving. Some people may prefer a little bit more feedback, myself included, but a muted response has always been beneficial for those of you who want the most forgiving feel out of your paddle. So the Fat Boy really is a perfect example of the modern take on a classic paddle. Soft and super forgiving, but of course, you do make a few sacrifices to get there. A ton of paddle face surface area is great for sweet spot size, but it also makes the paddle a little bit less aerodynamic, so hand speed is slower despite its shorter length. You also lose a little bit of that whippy feel that you need to hit spin. The extra material makes it more difficult to roll the paddle around the ball, which is what you need for topspin. Pop and power are actually quite good here because of the Kevlar top sheet. Obviously not top tier, but this certainly isn't as one-dimensional as control paddles used to be. Again, just a great modern example of a paddle that's built primarily for control, but because of all the technological innovations we've seen in this sport, it's actually decently well-rounded. Coming in at number 3, we have the Selkirk Vanguard Pro Epic. Now, earlier this year, Selkirk released the Vanguard Control series, but this new line is significantly better. For one, the Vanguard Pro is thermoform. Now, you might be hearing that and thinking, well, doesn't that mean that it's more powerful and less controlled? Well, that's not necessarily true anymore. The real important thing with thermoform paddles is that there are no gaps in their construction, so they have a super solid and consistent feel. Yes, original thermoform paddles were quite rigid as a byproduct of that solid feel, but what brands have been focusing on a lot this year is softening up the feel of thermoform paddles, and the Vanguard Pro Epic is a perfect example of that. There are 4 layers of raw carbon fiber sandwiching the core, which makes it feel a lot more plush while still maintaining that great connection to the ball. It's actually softer than the Vanguard Control, which isn't thermoformed, and softer than pretty much any other raw carbon thermoform paddle, which is why it's so good in the control game. It also has a bit of that dynamic playability that I've mentioned you get from certain paddles like Kevlar paddles, the Rhombus Nova, and Pulsar FX series. Selkirk has engineered these carbon layers so that they can firm up when you accelerate the paddle face, which makes it perform quite well for power and spin. Power is definitely not off the charts, and you do have to swing quite hard to access it, but that's also part of why the paddle is so good in the soft game and never really prone to accidental pop-ups. My one little issue with the Vanguard Pro series is the slightly antiquated shapes that Selkirk are using. They have updated the Invicta recently to have a slightly longer handle, but it's still not as maneuverable as is average for an elongated paddle nowadays. That's also why I've gone for the Epic here. It's a 16-inch wide body paddle, so it is a lot more maneuverable than the Invicta. That shape is somewhere in between the J3K and the Fat Boy, so you get the best of both worlds between good hand speed and a big sweet spot. It's really a top tier control paddle, so is the Invicta, by the way. Both of these paddles are proof to me that Selkirk is always innovating and actually doing most of the heavy lifting on the control side of things these days. Coming in at number 2, we have the Pickleball Apes Pulse V. Now this might surprise some of you because I said it was the best control paddle of the year in our awards video, but that was only for paddles that came out this year. No spoilers, but anyways, the Pulse was kind of funny because I actually thought it was going to be a power paddle with the name Pulse, you know, add pulse onto your shot and all that, but it's actually way more geared towards control. The face material is Kevlar, so it has that plush and forgiving feel, and I do find it to be a little more muted than average for a Kevlar paddle, which again helps make it even more forgiving. They haven't stopped there though. There's a reason it's coming in much higher than the J2K and J3K. Underneath the top sheet, Pickleball apes have added a carbon ring layer to the outside of the paddle that's there to increase structural rigidity. That makes it extremely stable on off-center hits. Honestly, one of the most stable paddles I've tested, and stability makes the paddle feel super consistent, which you want in the control game. And they still don't stop there with control focus technology. Underneath that carbon ring, there's a foam edge wall, which I know is really common, but the difference here is that this foam wall is about twice as thick as average. That expands the sweet spot, and it adds to this paddle's soft feel to create a Kevlar thermoform paddle that is way softer than average, extremely stable, and super forgiving, especially the Pulse V. The Pulse V has a very similar shape to the J3K I mentioned earlier, where it's a wide body paddle with a really long handle, so tons of maneuverability, and still a bigger sweet spot than the Pulse S and the Pulse E. The other thing with all the Pulses is that they have great variety. Plenty of spin potential and tons of power and pop, a little bit less than the J2K and J3K, but more than all the other paddles on this list. I've also obviously heard the rumors that these paddles might become more powerful after break-in. I haven't played with one individual paddle long enough to get to that point, but if it's true, then that can only be beneficial. There's no springy foam in here like on true power paddles, so they shouldn't ever get to a point where they're tough to control, so more power wouldn't really come at the expense of anything. There's really only one winner for this award. It was the same paddle last time. The Selkirk Luxe Control Air Invicta is the best control paddle on the market right now. What's happened over the last 8 months since I made that review is that this paddle has stayed the best and the rest of the pack has caught up, but there's still really no competing here. First, let's talk about what makes the Luxe Control Air series so special. Then I'll talk about why I picked the Invicta over the Epic. First of all, these paddles are thermoformed, so they're super responsive, but they are buttery soft. They don't really make paddles this soft anymore. There's no firmness whatsoever, and the dwell time is super long because of that thick 20mm core, so the sensation of control you get on any type of touch shot is different to any other paddle right now, at least from the ones that we carry. This is kind of what paddles used to be like in terms of softness and dwell time before thermoforming. The difference here is that these paddles are significantly more responsive because of that thermoformed construction. That's the real X factor between these and older soft paddles, so if you're looking for the best all-out control, this is what you should go for. Now, the reason I've picked the Invicta over the Epic is that, yes, the Epic is a little bit more forgiving with its wide body shape, but these paddles already have such massive plush forgiving sweet spots that you don't really need more than what the Invicta has. The Epic is also quicker, but because the Invicta has that aerodynamic throat and it's edgeless, it's already plenty fast. So again, you don't really need much more hand speed than what the Invicta gives you. Of course, you can go for the Epic if you want to crank those two characteristics up to the max, but you do lose a lot of leverage with that shorter shape, which hurts power and spin. Power and spin are never going to be top tier on paddles this soft, but the elongated shape makes the Invicta at least competitive at those playability characteristics. Spin is actually quite impressive on that paddle because it's so soft you feel like you can really grab and shape the ball. But it does have spring on grit, so that texture does go away pretty quickly, which is unfortunate. Overall, though, the Luxe Control Airs are still fantastic paddles, and definitely still the best on the market if you're looking for control. It would be cool to see some other brands go all out for control like this, but I understand that's not necessarily what people want these days, so it is harder to sell. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of the paddles we talk about here, you can come visit us in store, or you can buy them online at racketsandrunners.ca.